So if you imagine scales, right, which is how I think what that image is of being equal to them all, you've got honoring your mother and father, gemilut chasadim, being a peacemaker, and then Talmud Torah balances them all out. And I think also the idea here is that the reason why Talmud Torah can balance them all out and should balance them all out is because the more you study Torah, the more you should be involved in doing those things on the other end of the scale. And again, we've got this statement that I mentioned earlier, he who engages exclusively in Talmud Torah is as one who has no God, which really lets you know that there were people who engaged exclusively in Talmud Torah. And so the rabbis had to create these very sharp, pithy aphorisms in order to zing them into getting out of the academy, getting out of the study hall, and participating in the life of the community. Within the rabbinic elite, there was frequent concern with the proper balance between studying and participation in family and communal affairs. That tension was then codified by some of the medieval legalists like Maimonides, who we've mentioned before, and we'll have a whole session on Maimonides in the future. But Maimonides wrote his legal code, the Mishneh Torah, in 1180, and he has a few things to say about Gemilut Chasadim. The rabbis distinguished between mitzvot that the rabbis themselves enacted and mitzvot that come from the Torah. Mitzvot, commandments that come from the Torah, they have divine authority. Mitzvot that the rabbis themselves enacted, you still have to follow them, but they're of a lower level of authority. What Maimonides does is he explains that the following mitzvot were formulated by the rabbis of the Talmud, but they derive their authority from the Torah itself. This is now Maimonides. It's a positive commandment, meaning you have to do it, from what they, the rabbis, said, to visit the sick, to comfort mourners, to attend to the diseased and all the to attend to the deceased and all the details surrounding the funeral, to tend to the bride to make sure that she has a proper dowry and trousseau, and to escort guests in and out. These are gemilut chasadim, which are done by the person and have no limits. Even though all of these commandments are spelled out by the rabbis in the Talmud, they all fall under the general rule of loving your neighbor as yourself. Right? That's the end of Maimonides. So he takes that verse in Leviticus 19, the verse that we started out with, love your neighbor as yourself, or show love to your neighbor as yourself is probably a better translation of that. And the rabbis unpack it into all kinds of ethical actions that, on the one hand, they're deeds of loving kindness, but according to Maimonides, they're actually commandments as well. So it's not as though you're doing it out of the voluntary love of your heart. You're commanded to do all those things. So there's a relationship between doing nice things and doing what you're commanded to do. That's how Gemilut Chasadim looks in the Middle Ages in terms of its codification by Maimonides. I thought that we would now jump several hundred years and talk a little bit about how Gemilut Chasadim worked itself out in this country, in the United States, even before it was called the United States. Perhaps you remember from your colonial history that Peter Stuyvesant was the governor of New Amsterdam. Well, it turns out that there was a group of Jews that left Recife, Brazil in 1654, and they arrived in the harbor of New Amsterdam, and Peter Stuyvesant didn't want to let them disembark. And so he sent a telegram, probably not a telegram, but he sent word to the Dutch West Indies Company, and through some Jewish influence in Amsterdam, the Dutch West Indies Company said, no, you've got to let these 23 Jews from Recife, Brazil, disembark. Remember, this is 1654. We're actually, this year, 2004, we're celebrating the 350th anniversary of the organized Jewish presence in this country. So the condition was Peter Stuyvesant wouldn't let these 23 Jews disembark from the boat unless they agreed to take care of their own. In other words, they couldn't become wards or charges of the state. They couldn't be on the dole. They couldn't be collecting unemployment. So this long tradition from the biblical period, rabbinic and medieval, of community support and making sure that people have a floor, a subsidized level of living, was one of the conditions for residency in the New World. So it starts that early. Now let's fast forward a couple of 100 years, 200 years. The Jews, the largest number of Jews to emigrate to the United States were from Eastern Europe. They were dirt poor. Between 1881 and 1914, 1917, the years around World War I, 2.25 million Jews from Eastern Europe emigrated, joining a native population of about 250,000. So in those, from 1880 to 1917, the American Jewish population went from 250,000 to 2.5 million, right? An incredible explosion of Jews in the new country, in the United States now. Dirt poor from what we call the Pale of Settlement, Russia, Poland, Ukraine, White Russia, Yellow-Russia, came to these shores. And the 250,000 Jews, even though they tended to be German Jews and felt a little embarrassed. The German Jews were of high culture, and they were a little embarrassed by these greenhorns who were coming in who didn't speak the language. They didn't even speak German. They spoke this kind of low-level German called Yiddish, this combination of Hebrew, mostly German, but a few Hebrew words thrown in. And they didn't dress nicely, and they weren't cultured, and they weren't polished, and they didn't know who Heinrich Heine was. But nevertheless, they felt a certain responsibility to help acculturate these Jews by providing seed money. So what we have as the Eastern European Jews come into this country is that the German Jews, who were relative old-timers in America, they established clinics, hospitals, old age homes, orphanages, vocational schools, settlement houses, and free loan societies. Now, that long list of things that the German Jews helped to establish is common to many other ethnic groups in the United States, except for free loan societies. That's something that is actually distinctive and unique to the Jewish community. Free loan societies, beginning in the 1880s, were an extension of that there's a biblical prohibition against charging interest in loans to other Jews. Let me read you that, one of those commandments from the book of Exodus. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, do not act toward them as a creditor, exact no interest from them. So the idea of free loans is already found in the biblical period. Notice, I'm sure people have the image that Jews were money lenders throughout history. This, of course, is true. The church positioned the Jews, that canon law prohibited Christians from loaning money at interest, using the same law in the Bible. So the only people that could then loan money to Christians were the Jews, because the Jewish prohibition was only about loaning money to other Jews with interest. And so you need credit in an economy. So it was important for many European countries throughout history to have a Jewish presence in order to provide the capital to keep their economies fluid. But now we have the free loan societies in the United States acting out this biblical idea. And Maimonides also, when he talks about the 8 stages of charity, he says that the highest level of charity is either giving someone what they need anonymously, helping them to start a business, or loaning them money without any interest. Why is loaning just as good as giving someone money? Because loaning preserves the person's self-esteem and integrity. You don't feel like you're taking a handout. Whether or not you are able to pay it back is a different question. Whether or not you do pay it back is a different question. But in terms of the self-esteem that one has, it's a little easier on your ego to accept a loan than it is to accept a handout, to accept a gift. In 1885, the Pittsburgh Platform that we talked about in the last lecture, they included what was already happening in America, the social gospel, as one of the last planks of their Pittsburgh Platform. Rabbi Emil Hirsch of Chicago really was the Reform rabbi who was influential in making sure that the social gospel wouldn't be exclusively associated with the Protestants in this country, but should also be something that the Jewish community should get behind. So the last plank of the Pittsburgh Platform reads as follows. In full accordance with the spirit of Mosaic legislation, right, you've got to link it back to us. You can't just say that we're borrowing it from the Protestants. So he wants to link the idea of the social gospel back to the prophets and to the Torah. In full accordance with the spirit of Mosaic legislation, which strives to regulate the relation between rich and poor, we deem it our duty to participate in the great task of modern times, to solve on the basis of justice and righteousness the problems presented by the contrasts and evils of the present organization of society. Now, it is indeed true that Reform Judaism was the first significant American denomination, but it was also the first denomination to really promote the idea of social justice. And even till this day, Reform Judaism is ahead of the other denominations in reaching out beyond the Jewish community, in doing acts of tikkun olam, what they translate as social justice, whether it's feeding the poor or clothing the naked, much more so than the other denominations. In the late 19th century, some of these Eastern European Jews, they actually formed little societies that were, actually it was usually the women who formed these societies that were specifically dedicated to one of those things. So there was a Malbish Arumim society, clothing the naked, where women would get together and sew clothes for other people in the community that needed some new clothes. So I've got a friend who remembers his grandmother talking about these Malbish Arumim societies, although I think she said it with a slightly different accent than I am saying it. Okay, let's now recap. What we spent the last 3 lectures talking about are Shimon the Righteous's pillars of what the world stands on: Torah, worship, and deeds of loving kindness. So I mentioned that this might be more than just a kind of literary convention. It really might be the rabbi's understanding that the world would dissolve back into chaos without the study of Torah, without laws, without sacrificial worship. Now, here we need to know a little bit about ancient Near Eastern sacrificial systems. The idea in the ancient Near East was that we sacrifice to God, and then God makes sure that things happen smoothly in this world. Or usually in ancient Near Eastern systems, it's we sacrifice to the gods in plural, and the gods make sure that we get rain in the appropriate season, and we don't have earthquakes, or the volcanoes don't wipe out cities. That idea was transferred and modified by the Israelites and later on by the rabbis, but there's still this kind of idea that the sacrifices are pleasing to God. And actually, in one passage in Genesis, when Noah offers sacrifices once he gets off the ark after the flood, it says that God smells the sweet savor of the sacrifices. So we have the sense that God does somehow get something out of the sacrifices, and it sustains the world. But laws and sacrifices aren't enough. You also need these deeds of loving kindness. And whether they're instituted as law, right, or as the Mishnah says, there's no end, there's no limit to what you can do for someone else. That certainly is the ideal in rabbinic sources, even though the more you do for someone else, it's a zero-sum game, the less time you have to study Torah. So finding that right balance between Torah study and devotion to the community and communal activism and social justice is a tension we see in the rabbis that goes up to this day as well. Okay, we spent the last several sessions looking at central deeds of rabbinic Judaism, right? The most important commandments or ritual activities within Judaism. The next several lectures are going to look at the most important ideas in rabbinic Judaism, concepts, and we'll begin with Messianism.